we just had 60 members of the US Congress decide, luckily it's not a majority, that we should immediately recognize Tibet and declare the Dalai Lama to be the head of Tibet. Now, why you would want to do this, and this is something that unfortunately many people don't know. I was speaking at a class some years ago at a university, and I asked the students there if they thought it was legitimate to be able to invade a country and overthrow their government. And about 50% of the class saw no problem with it. They didn't realize that this is in violation of international law, that there's such a thing as sovereignty, that you don't run around the planet telling people how to govern their countries, just as you don't run next door and tell your neighbor how to raise their children. But people don't have a sense of that. There are certain things that have been stated by China and Russia to be red lines. And if people knew history, they would understand why, and they would understand that why provoking crises, whether it's over Taiwan or Ukraine, you are absolutely risking nuclear war. Some people in the military are aware of this. Some support the idea of nuclear war, and some quite aggressively and outspokenly oppose this and are warning of the dangers of it. But we are in a period of great danger, and that's the other factor in a holiday season, is that people tend to be diverted and thinking of other things and not what's happening in the world. The last thing I want to mention, as I have been mentioning, is the situation in Afghanistan, because it's dire and it's very urgent. That the U.S. Treasury, actually our Federal Reserve, is holding $9.2 billion from the Afghan Central Bank. That after occupying that country for 20 years, really encouraging warfare there over 40 years, and then leaving, again, we've decided, and we can, I think, only thank ourselves and us and the NATO occupation for the fact that the Taliban now run the country. But we've said, well, we don't like you, so we're going to withhold your money. Well, that means that everything in Afghanistan is shut down. They can't pay teachers, doctors, 2,500 clinics have shut down, and 23 million people, including 3 million children under the age of 5, are faced with death by starvation this winter. Because of that decision. It is a real crime against humanity. It has to be reversed. Everyone should be discussing this. Apparently already now the deaths have begun of infants, of babies, at a horrifying rate. And this will be our responsibility. It is simple enough to release the funds. The Taliban has been put in a position where they have to run the country. Starving their population to death only increases the risk of terrorism. The new opposition to the government there is in the form of ISIS. So this is the mess that we are creating by this policy, and it has to be reversed. So with that said, maybe perhaps we can have all of our guest speakers up for a minute here. I will be joined today by Lynn Speed, who people know Lynn's husband from my programs, Dennis Speed. She is also a longtime associate of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute. I have Susan Murray Miller, who is the town and village historian of Cherry Valley, and also is a, what are you at the New York State Historical Association?
Yes.
You're what?
Yes. New York State Historical Association, and secretary of my museum.
Wonderful. Yes, so she is joining us. And we have, again, we had a couple weeks ago, Michael Spinner, who is the vice president of the Society of the Old Brooklynites. And also, I'm happy to say, he may not consider it as important, but an amateur cellist, which is very important.
I used to be good at it when I was a teenager.
Well, that will happen.
School, so
and
I just
he's been very involved in the industrial board of Southwest Brooklyn, a planning board, which your father founded, I guess you said. And I learned last time has a great deal of expertise on the pipes and water management system of New York, and we still have to get together. Yeah, sewage treatment, to discuss that. So as always, participation in my program does not constitute endorsement of my candidacy or any candidacy. The views expressed by the speakers are their own, and I may or may not agree with them. But in this day of great censorship and limitation of disagreements and freedom of speech, I think it's really urgent to have a dialogue and to not be afraid of disagreements where they come up. And I think what you'll hear tonight is extremely important. So we will go ahead now. Michael, why don't you take it away?
Well, you wanted me to speak about the Battle of Long Island and
Yes.
The way the Marblehead sailors with their rowboats came all the way from Massachusetts through the East River, which is a tidal way, and came all the way down and saved Washington's army from the British, who were landing all through Brooklyn and in New York, from Staten Island, from the West Indies, from England. And it was a coordinated event for the British with many sailing ships. And they all seemed to land at the same time. And the British chased Washington's 5,000 troops out of New York. The British thought that Washington had more troops, but he didn't. There was even 500 or 600 soldiers that marched up from Maryland in 23 days. That's 550 miles. And they made that in 21 days to support Washington's troops. But they wound up supporting his retreat. Now, if you show picture one, map one, there we go. Now you have where the British were landing. You see on the bottom of the page, you see the British ships, and all the red lines are the British Army. Now, they overwhelmed the American army. And if you show map two, that's where that blue line is how the Marblehead sailors, fishermen, and soldiers, they were soldiers under the command of Commander Glover. I think he was a colonel at the time. I think Washington promoted him later. They came and they took these rowboats and brought both the men and horses and cannon across the East River. Now, someone asked me, said, that's a long way to row. But when you have several men rowing in a really sleek boat, it wasn't that hard. And the East River, when they came down the East River, the tide was going out. So the East River was rushing in the direction they were going. And then when they went to leave, tide was coming in and was rushing. I don't know if you ever sat and watched the East River. It's it's really not a river. It's a tidal way. So now if you show picture two, map, the next map, there. You can see where the blue X is. That's where the Maryland soldiers split off. And there was, they called them the Maryland 400, but there was really around 290 combatants that attacked the British at that point there on 3rd Avenue. And they were pretty much killed to the man. If you show the next picture, you'll see where Washington crossed from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Now, in Manhattan, I'm certain that, and it's my opinion, that a lot of the New York civilians assisted in carrying these boats, which I'll show you a picture of how the boats were later, across Manhattan, up the west side, back into the Hudson River, and over to Fort Lee. So show the next slide. This is the picture of a painting done in 1858 by Alonzo Casal, I believe, and it depicts the battle where the Marylanders were fighting the British. You see the British redcoats off to the distance. Next slide. When the British captured these soldiers, they didn't first put them in the prison ships, where they pretty much a death sentence if you got on the prison ships. This is the Sugar House, which is on 28 Liberty Street, or was on 28 Liberty Street. And that's where they first put all the prisoners in. And it was next to a Dutch Reformed church. right next to the sugar house, and they kept these soldiers, enlisted soldiers, and kept them as soldiers. When they moved over to the prison ships, which I explained 2 weeks ago, they really weren't kept very well, and the British did not consider the Americans or the colonists even humans. They were as bad as slaves. They were treated. They didn't have any saying. A British soldier or British civilian or British citizen actually could go into a person's house and say, "I have to live here. Too bad you have to leave." Next slide. This is the boat that the Marblehead, Massachusetts sailors used. And imagine carrying that. And they had to carry it somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 miles. But I'm certain that citizens, New Yorkers, helped them because no one really liked the British. I think there's one more slide. Is that the last one?
That's the last one.
Okay, so if you can go back to the first map. See, if you see where they went up to Fort Lee and out, that's how the British they were surprised. Actually, the British were so surprised that Washington escaped. They came in with a really dominant military force, trying to just shut down the revolution. Now, if you talked about the different things that we did, if you look at the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, those are the things, those 10 things were the major things that the Americans didn't like about what was happening to them and what the British were doing to them, basically. I think it's 5 minutes, right? I can go further, but that's if
great.
anyone's got any questions.
Good. We'll have time for questions, and I think Lynn Speed, who's going next. The reason I wanted this order, and it said the dates on the screen, but we're going sort of in chronological order of some of the early scenes of the revolution. And as people saw, the first date that you showed there was in August of 1776.
August
the Declaration
22nd.
Yes, and the Declaration of Independence was July 4th of 1776. So we're moving along from the early part of the revolution, and you can see that it did not exactly have a terribly auspicious beginning. So with that, let's go to Lynn Speed.
Okay, thank you, Diane. So let me start by saying that it was 45 years ago that the LaRouche movement actually initiated a major American history project, and colleagues of ours published several books and numerous articles, among them The Political Economy of the American Revolution, How the Nation Was Won, Treason in America, and so on, and numerous other papers and articles. Now, these works uncovered, or rather rediscovered, the truth about American history, and that the fundamental divide in the world was not what we had been taught in school, communism versus capitalism, but in fact, the American system, or a republic with a small r, governed by citizens, versus the British, or more broadly, an oligarchical system ruled by a select few. And this is what really started my interest in research into American history. This research established very early the universal nature of the American Revolution, with many, many different people from different backgrounds, including Black Americans, who participated as freemen and patriots, not just slaves, as the New York Times 1619 Project would have us believe, but participated in the first successful anti-colonial revolution. And recently, there's been renewed interest in not only discovering, but in some cases admitting, the inclusive character of that revolution. This past weekend, I had the pleasure of traveling to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, the site of Washington's historic crossing of the Delaware, for a reenactment of those events, which took place actually on Christmas night. Many people think it's Christmas Eve, but the crossing actually takes place on the night of Christmas, 245 years ago. And we should already really be preparing in a major way for the 250th anniversary of the birth of our republic. There were obvious flaws in that endeavor, which we now hear recited ad nauseum and often inaccurately reported. But the undeniable truth is that the events between particularly December 25th and January 3rd, 1776 to 1777, changed the course of history for all mankind for the better. And these are not lessons, as we all share here, they're to be relegated to some dusty bookshelves, or worse, to be Googled with a snapshot view of what happened. But this is something about ordinary individuals who were driven to become greater than their destiny. They were Black, they were white, they were Hispanic, Christian, Jewish, rich, poor, farmers, seamen, teachers, merchants, mechanics, laborers, etc., as different as you can imagine, but they were all united with a shared commitment to the cause of liberty and self-government. And this is exemplified, as Michael already mentioned, by the outstanding Marblehead Regiment, which was a brigade, essentially a fisherman from Marblehead, Massachusetts. And at the reenactment festivities, I had the opportunity to meet Patrick O'Donnell, who's just published a book entitled The Indispensables, the diverse soldier mariners who shaped the country, formed the Navy, and rode Washington across the Delaware. And the book jacket reads, quote, "The Marblehead Regiment, led by Colonel John Glover, the U.S. Army was the most diverse in history." And he goes through different people, all the people I just mentioned who were in it. And he says the U.S. Army would not reach that again for more than 170 years. And this refers to the first fully integrated units, or refers to the fact that there were no fully integrated units until Truman's 1948 desegregation of the Army. So you'll hear a lot more about the Marbleheads, I think, during the course of this program. The Continental Army was composed, as I said before, of ordinary individuals who, in a time of grave crises, transformed themselves to do something extraordinary. And in the present time of grave crisis, COVID-19, which has already killed over 5 million individuals globally, global famine, which affects over 2 million of our fellow human beings, cultural despair, which is devastating our young people, and the tension and threat of world war. Our challenge today is to really personify the best of the character of those men and women who struggled so valiantly to make our existence possible. So as I go through briefly this story of Washington's crossing, I'd like you to think on this idea that was eloquently captured by Lyndon LaRouche in addressing a conference some years ago. And he says, if we can get the first slide, "In a true republic, the true citizen is personally accountable to the Creator for the outcome of that republic, for the outcome of the general welfare as it affects all persons in that republic, for the outcome thus of every personal life in that republic, and the outcome of the role of that republic in the world for the welfare of humanity as a whole and of every individual personally, and of every individual personality, present and future, of humanity as a whole. The individual citizen of a republic is personable accountable to the Creator to the extent that that individual either has the capacity to influence the course of events or can develop the capacity needed to influence the course of events. Next slide. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot in this crisis will shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet, we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Thomas Paine. And these words were published on December 19, 1776, from his American Crisis in the local Pennsylvania newspapers for the first time. General Washington and his troops were encamped at that moment at McConkey's Ferry, on the west side of the Delaware, across from Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's army has been decimated. Only about 6 months earlier, in the scenes that Michael was describing, he had 20,000 to begin with, in good spirits and in good physical condition. And they had come, of course, from their earlier successes in 1775 at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. In July of 1776, the same week that Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, the British fleet arrives, and you've heard that story, and Washington's troops suffer humiliating defeat. In November, the Continental Army would begin in its ignominious retreat, only now later known as the Retreat to Victory, fleeing from the British for nearly 100 miles from Fort Lee, New Jersey to Trenton, and then the first crossing of the Delaware to temporary safety in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Between September and December, 11,000 American volunteers had given up the fight and returned to their families. Many were killed or taken prisoner. Many were sick. Washington now has less than 6,000 soldiers. The artist Charles Willson Peale, who watched the first crossing from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, gives the following description. It was a hellish scene that I had ever beheld. A man staggered out of line and came toward me. He had lost all of his clothes. He was in a dirty old blanket jacket. His beard was long and his face was full of sores, which so disfigured him that he was not known to me on first sight. Only when he spoke did I recognize my brother James. Next slide. And this is Peale, not only a painter but an inventor, and this is one of his many famous portraits of Washington. Some of them actually done from life and action during the battle. You can take that down. To add to these troubles, 1/3 of Washington's scant army is very sick with smallpox, along with several other diseases which are ravaging his exhausted and hungry troops. Later in the war, in 1777, at Washington's Morristown encampment, when smallpox is devastating the Continental Army, Washington makes America's first national public health directive and makes the controversial decision to have Dr. Nathaniel Bond, who's a fighting surgeon and another Marbleheader, to inoculate the army. Now, this paltry army, with this paltry army, 90% of the enlistments are also scheduled to expire in less than 2 weeks on December 31st. Without a sudden and dramatic victory to turn the tide, all would be lost. So a bold, innovative decision is needed. Next slide. So the opportunity for such a decisive victory came with Washington's audacious proposal to cross the Delaware on Christmas night and launch a surprise attack against the Hessian troops who were stationed at Trenton to watch Washington and the Continentals. Almost everybody knows this famous painting. It was done by German-born Emanuel Leutze. It was completed in Germany in 1850 during the period of the Revolutionary Republican upsurges in Europe. And the painting came to the United States in 1851. It was purchased and displayed throughout the United States. And during the Civil War, it was actually used to raise money for the Union cause, the Sanitary Commission, and the anti-slavery movement. It was later donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it now hangs in their American wing. And I would really recommend, if you have only seen the reproductions, you'll be really surprised. So I would recommend that you see it. It's colossal. It measures 12 feet by 21 feet. And of course, there have been many attacks against its so-called inaccuracy in depicting the scene that Christmas evening. People say it's the wrong type of boat, it's the wrong people in the boat, the river didn't look like that, etc., etc. None of these criticisms are really to the point because the picture captures perfectly the spirit and truth of the historical moment. The boat is filled with 12 people, and some people say 13, but I couldn't find the 13th one, and they represent precisely the type of mixture you would have found in Washington's army. So let's quickly take a closer look. Next picture. Oh, this is just to give you a sense of the scale of it. Next. Okay, so the centerpiece of the picture, sort of towering over, is George Washington. You can see he's there dressed in a continental uniform, and he holds a telescope to see ahead and also carries a saber to prosecute the war. Next to him, to his right, is James Monroe, Lieutenant James Monroe, who's the 5th President of the United States. He's holding an American flag straight against the storm. And Monroe led an important unit of Virginian infantry in the Battle of Trenton. He was seriously injured, and just parenthetically, his life was saved by a Dr. Riker, who had just joined Monroe's company as a volunteer the night before the prophetic march to Trenton. Next to that, and Loiter is very precise with the details, to his immediately right is a different uniform. And by the way, the figures at the reenactment actually were true to all of these units, all of these different divisions, and many of them actually personified a precise individual soldier. So that's the white is the Smallwood silk stocking Maryland regiment, and then in the front there is probably a prosperous Baltimore merchant. He has on a boat coat and an oil hat. Next. Okay, so here we are at the bow of the boat, and you'll see at the very front is a Western rifleman with a hunting shirt and deerskin leggings. Next to him, you'll see a Scottish American, and he can be identified by his Balmoral tartan hat. And then you'll notice and this surprises many people who haven't really taken a close look. There's a Black American, a Marblehead fisherman, and that he's clearly identified with his short blue tarpaulin jacket, which was the outfit or uniform of the Marbleheaders. Next. Okay, and now if you go to the figure in the red flowing shirt, it's an androgynous figure, possibly a woman. Many women also played key roles in the revolution. Behind her, or behind that figure, you see a soldier in a full dress uniform, which is very unusual that people actually had full dress at that point, given their conditions. Blue coat, perhaps possibly Hazlitt's Delaware Regiment. Next slide. Immediately next to them, you see two farmers with their blanket coats. One has a double-barreled shotgun in the front, and the other one is clearly extremely sick. His head is all bandaged up. Next. And then finally, in the stern of the boat, you have a Native American depicted, who is also in the same style Western hunting shirt as the person in the bow, but he's distinguished both by his features, moccasins on his feet, which you can see there, and the pants. Okay, next. And there's Lloyd's, who puts his name in 1861, the date he did this, on one of the ice blocks. Okay, you can take that down. So pulling together such a diverse group of people into a single fighting unit, which was capable of defeating the most formidable military force ever assembled to that point, really attests to Washington's unique leadership capabilities, a capacity to organize a kind of coincidence of opposites around a higher purpose, helped to create the unique character of the Continental Army and of the citizens of the new republic. This is really in counter-distinction to the British Army, and I think you'll learn more about that story when we hear about the Cherry Valley Massacre. This American-style leadership is epitomized in a report which is recounted by David Hackett Fisher in his book, Washington's Crossing. And he writes, the backcountry regiments which joined the Continental Army outside Boston made much trouble for George Washington. They started very serious trouble with New Englanders. It happened in Cambridge that when a regiment of Virginia riflemen in white linen frocks, ruffled and fringed, met Glover's Marblehead regiment in their round jackets and fisherman trousers. There were mutual shouts of derision, and then something worse. Many of the Virginians were slave owners, and some of the Marblehead men were former African slaves. Insult gave way to blows, and blows to a fierce struggle with biting and gouging. One spectator wrote that in less than 5 minutes, more than 1,000 combatants were on the field. Americans from one region had begun to fight Americans from another part of the country on a scale which was larger than the battles at Lexington and Concord. Washington acted quickly. A soldier from Massachusetts named Israel Trask watched him go about it. As the fighting spread through the camp, Washington appeared with his, quote, colored servant. Both were on horseback. Together, the general and William Lee rode straight into the middle of the riot. Trask watched Washington with awe as he, quote, with the spring of a deer, he leaped from his saddle, threw the reins of his bridle into the hands of his servant, and rushed into the thickest of the melees. With an iron grip, he seized two tall, brawny, athletic, savage-looking riflemen by the throat, keeping them at arm's length, alternately shaking and talking to them, unquote. Talking was probably not the right word. The rioters stopped fighting. They all turned in amazement to watch Washington in action, and then they fled at the top of their speed in all directions. The trouble ended without courts, irons, or whips that were more terrible than death to the proud back settler. In a few moments, Washington and William Lee had restored order in the army. Trask remarked that, quote, hostile feelings between two of its best regiments were extinguished by one man, unquote. So I think that gives you some idea. Next slide. And here's Washington and Billy Lee. This is a painting by John Trumbull. William Lee is another hero of the Revolution. He was Washington's slave, who he made a manservant. For 2 decades, William Lee accompanied Washington nearly everywhere. As a manservant or a valet, Lee assisted Washington with myriad tasks, including delivering very important secret messages. Lee was a brilliant horseman in a class with Washington himself, who was known as one of the best riders of his day. And he regularly accompanied Washington on hunting trips and other adventures. He served with Washington throughout the Revolutionary War. He was responsible for organizing the general's personal affairs, including all of his papers. And he was later emancipated by Washington. The Marquis de Lafayette, when he returned to the United States in 1824 to commemorate 50 years of the Revolution, made a special visit to Mount Vernon to see his old friend and comrade Billy Lee. And it's of note that Lafayette, together with Washington's other young aides, Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, had held many sessions during the Revolution, arguing with Washington in favor of emancipation of all African Americans. Okay, you can take that down. The 14th Continental Regiment, also known as the Marblehead Regiment or Glover's Regiment, was raised in Massachusetts. You've already heard something about them, so I'll skip over some of this. But they're recruited from the fishing towns in the North Shore of Massachusetts. And their commander is Colonel Glover. You can put up the next slide. And Glover, who's a merchant and fisherman, runs his military unit with the same discipline that he ran his ships at sea. In a profession that's really wrought with danger, promotion and command was based on intelligence, courage, and capability, not money or class or privilege or race or religion. So from the onset, Glover and his men insisted on the same standard for the army and for their regiment that they had practiced at sea. According to reports, Washington was initially not happy about the enlistment of Black Americans, but he and Glover worked out a series of compromises. First, allowing existing soldiers to remain, but no new enlistments. Then, tolerate but not approve new enlistments. Then, recruit Black Americans but not allow them to command. And finally, permitting Black officers permitting the existence of Black officers. In fact, several Black Americans rose to the rank of colonel during the war. It would not be surprising if a lot of these changes actually came during the historic December 25th crossing, because Glover really made it a requirement that his men be in absolute command during the crossing of the Delaware, and they superseded all the other officers at the time. Prior to Christmas of 1776, Glover's people had saved Washington's army on a couple of occasions. You've heard about that. So it's really lawful that with that predicament, Washington turns to Glover and his regiment to accomplish the impossible, ferrying 2,400 men and horses and cannon across an ice-choked river with very fast, very dangerous currents in the dark of the night, in total silence and secrecy, to launch a surprise attack against the Hessians at Trenton. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think it's the one after that, from the... Okay. Yeah, this is a picture from the actual reenactment last weekend. And it appears, you can see the soldiers are standing there on the Pennsylvania side. And if you look across, and it doesn't look very far at all, looks pretty easy. You can get over to the New Jersey side and then on to Trenton. Well, it was not true that it was that easy in December of 1776. America was experiencing a mini ice age during this time, with colder than average winters. People will remember the horrific conditions in Morristown and Valley Forge. And even with relatively milder winters, I learned that over 60% of the reenactment crossings have failed due to inclement weather conditions. On Christmas 1776, with all the plans, things were horrific and began to go wrong right from the onset. Washington had planned for the army to depart from 3 separate locations just after dark and get over to the other side by midnight, and then begin a 10-mile march to Trenton and arrive before dawn. There were delays up and down the river. A nor'easter began that evening, compounding the icy, snowy conditions. 2 of Washington's 3 forces were defeated by the ice and could not even get across the water. Do we have a slide of the Durham boats? You can put that up. If not, it's okay. Anyway, the Durham boats were key to this. You can see one there on the river. They were huge freight carriers developed by the Durham Ironworks to haul iron. And oh yeah, that's a good picture of it. Iron, grain, wood, other supplies. They're huge. They range from about 40 feet long to 8 feet across, 3.5 feet in depth. But they're shallow water boats. They can carry 30,000 pounds, 15 tons, but they only displace about 30 inches of water. So they're perfect for carrying armies and equipment. It was not until 4 a.m. in the morning before the Continental Army had all crossed and they began to march to Trenton. So they were already 4 hours behind and severely hampered and slowed down by conditions. At sunrise, which is when Washington wanted to already be beginning his attack, they are still 2 miles from Trenton, and the nor'easter is raging. but there's so much sleet, snow, and rain that you can't see the sun. And the snow is preventing anything from being seen more than a few feet ahead. It's also muffling the sound of the troops, the horses, and the cannons that are coming over the road. So I guess we could call this good climate change. It's important also to note that contrary to British propaganda, the Hessian forces were not recovering from a drunken Christmas revelry. Their commander, Colonel Rahl, had been exacting in all of his precautions and perhaps even over vigilant. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details of or any of the details of the battle. Just suffice to say, the American artillery gained the high ground. The battle was over in approximately 45 minutes. Colonel Rahl was fatally wounded and died that night. And the Hessians altogether lost 918 men. 22 were killed. 83 were seriously wounded, and they took about 900 officers and men as prisoners, as well as much needed supplies. The picture of the capture of Trenton, you can put that slide up. So these are just some of the reactors. No, go back 2 pictures. So Washington and his troops have to still return across the Delaware back to Pennsylvania. And over the next 10 days, there's going to be 2 more crucial battles, the Second Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton. But these victories would allow international forces to back up the Americans, notably the young Lafayette and French forces that arrive in the next year with important monetary and material support. I mean, I would say the rest is history. This is a momentous turning point. And in such a situation, I think in more ways than one, we find ourselves today. And it's the courage of individuals to act as many thousands of ordinary people did to build a republic. Our task, as George Washington, as Benjamin Franklin said after the Constitutional Convention, our task now is to keep it. So I'll conclude there.
Great. Thank you very much. That whole story is always so inspiring and wonderful. And I think people really appreciate it. Now, by way of introduction of Susan, she's going to describe something that many people probably have never heard of. And one of the reasons that it's never been heard of is that the story actually has been censored and silenced, particularly with some egregious actions after World War I began, when the British were supposed to be the ally of the United States, and it became verboten to ever say anything bad about them. And I'm just going to show a couple of slides here very quickly to give you a sense. Basically, at one point there was a film produced, which The Spirit of 1776, it was called, which in part told, I think it was quite a long epic, apparently 18 reels. I don't know how long that took at that time in 1916, 1917. But the producer, ultimately, the film was shut down and the producer was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And this was actually the beginning of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which people may be aware are being used against people like Julian Assange to this day. And I think you should think of not only what that means in terms of freedom of speech, but also the intention to wage a war which is unjust. So we're going to see here what a historian Edwin Burroughs had to say about this period at this time and what happened. This is from his book, The Forgotten Patriot, and he, by the way, was a native of Brooklyn, New York, and passed away just in 2018. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany, and the United States, in its 141st year of its independence, became Great Britain's de facto ally. Prompted by the Anglophobia simmering among Americans of Irish or German descent, and under intense pressure from President Woodrow Wilson, Congress quickly followed up the declaration of war with the passage of the Espionage Act. This harsh and sweeping measure made it a federal offense punishable by death or by a stiff fine and up to 30 years in jail to publish or utter anything that would tend to aid the enemy, interfere with recruiting, or promote insubordination and disloyalty in the armed forces. The Sedition Act of 1918 would extend these provisions to prohibit, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language, unquote, about the government. Think about that. You're not allowed to say anything. This is almost like lèse majesté, right? Against the government, in a sense. So a wave of prosecutions ensued, leaving no doubt that the Wilson administration intended to suppress all anti-war and anti-British feeling in the country. Hundreds of radicals went to prison, 75 newspapers, many written for German American or Irish American newspapers, were either banned from the mail or forced to stop publishing war news. British propaganda mills, meanwhile, flooded the United States with lurid descriptions of German war crimes, paeans to Anglo-Saxon democracy, and amiable references to the American Revolution. One writer dubbed it a single regrettable incident caused by the most muddle-headed ministry that ever mismanaged the affairs of Great Britain. In books, pamphlets, lectures, and college classrooms, leading academic historians encouraged Americans to see that their ancient animosity for the British stemmed from ignorance and prejudice. And I'll just add that people responsible for celebrating Evacuation Day, which was when the British finally left New York in November of 1783, are proposing that the U.S. and we should call it British-American Friendship Day, and that's going on to this day. So this is something about the film, a flyer announcing it, and this is the clipping announcing that the producer, Robert Goldstein, has been found guilty under these acts, espionage and sedition, and ultimately ended up getting sentenced to 10 years in prison. So this may indeed be one of the reasons why people have not heard the story which we are about to hear from historian Susan Miller. So Susan, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start with slide 1, which is the map, and I'll just explain where Cherry Valley actually is. It is technically kind of like in the center of New York State. It is near Canajoharie, New York, Palatine, Cooperstown, or not too far from Cooperstown, New York, or Cobleskill. And this is a territory map of the early days. This is all in the frontiers of New York, as we call it. Basically, it's in the Seneca and the Mohawk territories. And so let's have slide 2. And this is a slide of the Iroquois Confederacy, Oneida, Onondaga, Stanwix, and we are almost right over in the left hand where the Mohawk River is. The Mohawks were not too far from Cherry Valley. The Mohawks were pretty friendly with before the war. The Mohawks were pretty friendly with all of the settlers in our area. We are west of the Mohawk River. We'll start with the Battle of Oriskany real quick on August 6th of 1777, followed up by the Wyoming Valley Massacre. And both of these were pretty well known at the time. Wyoming Valley was in July of 1778, and Oriskany was 1777. And during that time, Britain and John Butler, who was the commandant of Fort Niagara at the time, and directly in line with Haldimand, who was the basically the number one man in the British military at that time to kind of like supervise the comings and goings of how the war was going to go. He had a lot of generals under him, and Haldimand was British, and he basically orchestrated the war from where he was in Canada, because by 1776, most of the Tories and Loyalists in the Mohawk Valley were already in Canada under the employ of course, the British government. Walter Butler, Captain David, Hyakatu, and Little Beard started from Seneca Town and the region of Fort Niagara to start their infamous campaign against Cherry Valley. And they had a reason for targeting Cherry Valley, very simply because three men, one in the Continental Congress, and the other two were major soldiers in the Battle of Wyoming Valley and in the Battle of Oriskany. They wanted revenge. The Seneca at the time were really very mad at the Patriots, and I'm going to just call them Patriots, or our revolutionary men, because at Wyoming Valley, the Patriots signed an act of capitulation when Butler came down and captured the Americans at Wyoming Valley. The soldiers who were left signed an act of capitulation. In other words, they would not fight again, ever. And they signed these pieces of paper under Butler, and never to fight again. Well, two more skirmishes happened, and there's these same soldiers fighting against and raiding Indian towns, native towns, and raiding forts and settlements along, or British forts and settlements along the frontier. So the Indians were pretty irritated at this, and they had a lot of they wanted revenge. The Senecas under Hyakatu and Little Beard and Captain David were, along with that, were Walter Butler, who was the son of John Butler, the commandant of Fort Niagara. And they were all British, and so along comes the roughly about 700 to 800 men are coming from Fort Niagara. They're walking, and they're actually walking and skirting the rivers with boats, and they're coming toward Cherry Valley. And the whole thing with coming toward Cherry Valley is the secrecy of it. They didn't come with horses or wagons or a lot of cannons. They came as a raiding party. And so there's about 700 to 800 Allied British forces with Butler's Rangers, which was a fighting force that fought with the Indians, British regulars, Tories and Loyalists, and the Indian allies, including the Senecas and the Mohawks. They get to Tioga, New York, just at the time about a good halfway to Cherry Valley. And not Walter Butler, but our friend Joseph Brant is coming to spend his winter at Fort Niagara. And at that time, Walter met him and said, "Hey, you're going with us, so turn around and let's go. We're going to raid Cherry Valley." Well, Joseph Brant had a lot of friends in Cherry Valley, and he said, "Nah, I don't want to do that. We're gonna continue on." And Walter says, well, you're going to get to Fort Niagara and you're going to find you don't have any more commission and you're not going to work for the British government anymore. And so you either come with us or suffer a starvation, etc. when you get to Fort Niagara. So really, Joseph had no real desire to do this, but he said, well, okay, I will definitely go with you. All right. So all the way from Tioga to just outside Cherry Valley, New York, we have two men who absolutely did not like one another, and that was Walter Butler and Joseph Brant. And all they did was argue. But anyway, we get into the early morning hours of November 11th, 1778. And we have sleet and rain, and we have fog. So the actual raid actually started at noon. Colonel Alden, the American commandant of Fort Alden, which was in Cherry Valley, kind of like where a cemetery now sits, was one of the first men to die in the raid. You have to understand that the Seneca do not like to sit around and just like the British military would fire, and they would keep up their firing onto the fort and pretty much stay stationary. The Seneca did not like that, and so what they did was basically run amok in the area. And we have at that time, Cherry Valley had a very large area. Let's face it, there was 100-acre plots that each farm had. There were many, many acres. And so they ran amok, scalping, murdering innocent men, women, and children, and taking prisoners. And so when the evening of November 11th came around, prisoners were pretty much, it was some 50 some odd prisoners, and they were taken to a farm, and the fort stood. The men in the fort, the American men in the fort, they stood. They had cannon. They had a lot of ammunition in the fort, so they were able to pretty much repel the attack. In the early morning hours of November 12th, Colonel Alden was dragged in. His body was dragged in and given a quick burial within the walls of the fort, which is now in the cemetery. And the soldiers in the fort, the American soldiers in the fort, went about as much as they could to drag in the bodies of men and women and children and stack them up kind of very quickly, because at about 8 a.m. the next morning, the second attack by the British regulars, by the Seneca, started again. And this time it went on all morning long until about noon. And at noon is when Walter decided, okay, let's get out of here, because they've got to have reinforcements coming, which they did have reinforcements coming from the Mohawk Valley, which is only about some 15, 20 miles away. So it wasn't a big deal to get reinforcements up from, say, Fort Clarks, but they never came until well after the third day. So the second day, the Tories and the British and the Indians start their homeward march. About 50 of their prisoners were released, but the women and the children of the major players on the American team, which would be Colonel Campbell and Colonel Clyde, their wives were, or not their wives, but Colonel Campbell's wife and their family was captured, and of course they were kept at Fort Niagara as basically to be traded off. But Mrs. Campbell never made it home until after the war was declared over with. After the prisoners were released, there were some 50. I'm going to go to, okay, Jose, I'm going to go to slide 4. Or no, I'm going to go to slide 3 first, please, Joseph. I'm going to give you a good picture here of Joseph Brand. And this is the Gilbert Stuart. I think this is the Gilbert Stuart picture. And then slide 4, please, Jane Wells. This is a very, slide 4, which would be Jane Wells and the massacre itself, showing the killing of Jane Wells. There we go. This, I'm sure a lot of people have seen. It was an early lithograph of the murder of Jane Wells by one of the Senecas, and a very interesting picture. And it's very important to remember the ferocity of both the Native Americans and a lot of Joseph Brandt's. You have to remember, a lot of Joseph Brandt's recruits in his unit were Tories and Loyalists who had lost their lands in the Mohawk Valley to the Patriot forces, and had to flee for their lives. And they were still fighting from Canada, where they had ended up going, because it was the only safe place for them to go. They would have been court-martialed or murdered or whatever if they stayed in the Mohawk Valley with their farms. A very interesting thing, though, happened, because the women and the children in a lot of these cases along the Mohawk River stayed behind to watch over the farms with their indentured servants. And a lot of the indentured servants were German and Irish. And so these women became targets of their supposed indentured servants. And I think a lot of the raids that Joseph Brandt did, and many of the Tory and Loyalist forces that came into the Mohawk Valley to raid, actually tried to get a lot of these women out of their homes and back up to Canada. The next morning, as I said, the attack resumed, and then the British and Indians left. They headed for Fort Niagara at that time. And this is slide 5, is the massacre monument. This is where there's some 30 some odd bodies of who was able to be rescued that morning. So Jose, slide 5 there, of the monument. That's in our cemetery. But underneath this monument is at least 30, if not more, bodies. Yep. And this is in the middle of our cemetery. Now, it's interesting, after the massacre, that it was the catalyst for the Sullivan and Clinton campaign of 1779. Cherry Valley is probably the one. Remember Cherry Valley. And General George Washington decided that I'm going to quote from a book, General George Washington decided that these pesky savages who had aligned themselves with the British should be exterminated. And he did use the word exterminated. Washington continued, the immediate objects of your expedition are the total destruction. And this was to Sullivan and Clinton. He said the immediate objects of your expedition are the total destruction and devastation of the Indian settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. And so we end with that, and then the war drags on. As this was the Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779, and then the war drags on, and it's basically a frontier battle. And Cherry Valley became the catalyst for that battle. It was one of the most brutal massacres ever, because it wasn't just a massacre where combatants, actually military men, most of them were inside the fort, were the main targets. It was women and children and elderly people who actually pretty much died that day. It was very indiscriminate, and Joseph Brant, in his favor, I gotta say, did a lot of trying to save people that he knew from the clutches of the other Native Americans who were in the British forces at that time. So we have Seneca, we have some Mohawks, we have Huron. The Oneidas were sided at that time with the Americans, so they did not participate. With that, I'm gonna conclude that that's our massacre in a very short time of what it actually was, but it was the catalyst for the Sullivan Clinton campaign of 1779. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's really quite horrific. And obviously, from what you described, this was not the standard of the fighting, or it wouldn't have stood out so much as something so absolutely horrible. I think it also underscores the difference between fighting on principle and getting taken in by questions of revenge, where you decide, where someone decides that they want the absolute extermination or elimination of someone, as opposed to winning on higher principle. So that concludes our formal presentations, and now I'd just like to get the thoughts of my co-panelists. And Michael, since maybe it's been a while since you spoke, what thoughts do you have, both on what you said earlier, what you've heard?
Very interesting insight. Some of the things I did not hear before. And I do have to ask, was that Clinton campaign the same Clinton from the Battle of Monmouth? Colonel Clinton, I think was it Howard Clinton?
No, it was Sullivan and Clinton,
Okay. So
and
it's
they
not the same
started.
Clinton.
Yeah, Sullivan and Clinton both,
Marshall
and their
Clintons.
armies. Yeah, and their ideas was to go west and at least through Tioga, Catherine's Town, all of those, and destroy them.
Right, right. And to impart on what you've said about how the British do the propaganda. Um,
Mhm.
in, in 1916, there was a HMS name should I should remember it. Alert, the HMS Alert. Right as Germany and England declared war on each other, the Alert went into the North Sea and pulled up the cables that were just recently laid so that Germany couldn't contact the United States directly. And they pulled them up and cut the cables, which it
Mm.
was a horrible thing to do. You want to be able to communicate with your enemy, but the British didn't want us, the Americans or Wilson, to communicate with the Germans. And before the war even started. That's
Wow.
interesting about that.
Yeah,
And
that is,
all the 19th century, a lot of deaths, and 20th century even more so. Uh, in the pursuit of liberty. I give a
Yeah.
speech at the rededication ceremony at the Fort Greene Monument every year. And I do make a point to saying that it's not a free country. This is a very expensive country, paid for with the blood and treasure of the Americans. And if we don't follow through for what they did for the millions yet unborn back 240 years ago, we're going to lose it. It's like my 8-year-old grandson. I don't think he realizes the freedoms we had only 10 years ago. And a child born today, are they going to realize what it feels like to walk around without a mask, without having to show your papers to get into a restaurant? This is troubled times, and it's up to us to do something about it, because I think we're a little bit more knowledgeable because we study history a little bit. So I'll pass it on to whoever wants to speak next.
On these questions, and I think Lynn probably has some things to say, but actually the freedoms that are more concerning are freedoms of thought and freedoms of speech. the idea that you're not even allowed to have certain quote unquote thoughts.
At the First
And
Amendment.
right.
I had a,
I mean, think about what happened with, take January 6th, for example. After that or going into that, anyone who said they had a question about the election, as people know, I've had people on my program who thought, well, we did something around Jimmy Carter years ago with LaRouche, that particular election, but the election where it was clearly, many people believe, stolen from John Kerry. So they became active in investigating elections. So there's been a lot of people questioning many elections. We had the New York City election recently where 130,000 votes suddenly got added into the total, and then they said they had to remove them, and everyone was supposed to believe on faith that they added and subtracted the same votes. I don't know how we would know. But the problem is you're not even allowed to ask. You're not even allowed to have a question about it. And what's been lost is a commitment to truth and a commitment to principle, which is the principle, for example, of the general welfare. Are we acting in the good of the population? Is that the actual intention of the government? This government will have a very difficult time demanding certain public health measures, because if you're shutting down entire hospitals or shutting down sanitation, as happened early in the pandemic, where the sanitation budget was cut by, I don't know, 40% or something, so you had trash all over the streets. If someone's doing that, it's very hard to believe that they're actually committed to the general welfare. And that's something that has to be restored. But again, if you're not even allowed to discuss it, if you're not allowed to have a debate, what happened to debates, debate teams? We see very, very little of that. But Lynn, go ahead, because I imagine you have some thoughts as well. And I also want to know from you, Lynn, what you would propose for how we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. I think we should think very bold, all of us. That's
Yeah,
for everyone.
we should take a lot
Mike
of
is going to get
ideas.
out his cello.
No, please. I so beg. Give me a year, at least a year. If you ask me to play the guitar, that'll be another thing.
No, but it's still 2026. But go ahead, Lynn.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, certainly we're seeing that kind of censorship again today. I actually saw an interesting program recently, which was uh, Cuomo's Chris Cuomo interviewing Maher, and it was interesting because, of course, Maher. My husband was playing it. And I said, "Gee, is that Fox TV?" And he said, "Oh no, this is Bill Maher." And he was talking about the fact that you have a real problem with the divisiveness in the country, and therefore, and this is of course what Washington was very much opposed to. I mean, in his farewell address to the nation, he talked about the problem with the divisiveness among parties, which he was against, but a more broad divisiveness that really afflicts our nation today. And he is talking about the fact that you have, it's not so much that people believe one thing or another ideologically, but he mentions a 5-year-old child screaming at her mother in a parking lot, and the mother standing there apologizing to the child. So people treat children as adults. You have many other expressions, of this kind of thing, and they think this is, liberty, this is freedom, and then you get this divide. If it's on one side, it has to be bad. If it's on the other side, if it's on your side, it has to be good, even though whatever it is. And this is really destroying the fabric of the country. And this is what, in our inception, the reason that the war was able to be prosecuted successfully was in large part the fact that Washington and others could actually pull the nation together with very, very diverging ideas about even what, liberty were. Obviously, those people who are fighting up in the Boston Commons that Washington, has to pick up and, pull apart, uh, don't believe have the same idea of liberty. Yet there was a transcendent idea in terms of the right of self government and the right to develop your creative capacities for that self government. And Washington was able to pull that all together in a unity. That's the strength of our nation. And I think we have to find ways of doing that. And therefore, the kind of thing you see with YouTube and now Twitter and so on. If you have this opinion, that cannot be spoken. That can't be talked about. The other side, of course, of the censorship, and not to go through a long thing because Diane's done several programs on this, but the fact that with her campaign and other independent campaigns, you can now have a, voting booth, or there's a campaign for a voting booth, on every corner. You don't even have to be a citizen to vote in local elections. And yet there's a complete restriction on the candidates that can run, with the outrageous parameter for independent statewide candidates at present of having to collect 45,000 valid signatures. I mean, it's in a period of a few weeks. So objectives are set that nobody except pre-selected, pre-chosen candidates will be able to run. So, people can vote for, everybody can vote, but you're totally restricted on what you can vote for, which is another form of this suppression, and so on. The other thing I just wanted to bring up, because Michael had mentioned or touched on some of the horrific things that were done with by the British and the prison ships, and what happened at Cherry Hill. And in general, I know that there was a principle in the American military from early on that Washington had established of treating prisoners of war in a benign way. And that, again, is a principle we seem to have forgotten in recent years. If you think about Guantanamo, certain other things that have been done. But this made a real difference, because if you want to have justice, you have to start by actually being a vehicle for that, representing that. And that principle in Washington was very important. So you ended up, for example, at the end of the war, I think it was something like 25% of the Hessians actually made a decision to stay in the United States and become American citizens, because they loved America. They came to love America and love its principles as a result of the fact that they saw a certain kind of justice far beyond what was even available to them at home, where one of the few choices for a future for their family was to become a mercenary soldier. So I think that's very, very important.
Oh, on this question of the 250th anniversary, here's a proposal that's come in. Why doesn't your campaign, hold on, I'm being told, okay. Why doesn't your campaign form a citizens volunteer committee to plan in the New York area a series of symposia in the next months to acquaint families and young people with much of what has been discussed today? They could become their own independent committee to organize the 250th anniversary of the country. That's actually a great idea, I think, and everyone here could participate in educating
Absolutely.
people. We could have a series of tours. We should have tours. We should have classes, symposia, and prepare to celebrate this.
Yeah, I think that's
And
a great idea. In fact, one of the things I was thinking is tours would be great. I would love to get out to Long Island and see some of these sites, which I haven't seen. I mean, I've done a lot of this in the New York metropolitan area and Brooklyn Heights, of course, I've seen, but where the various battle scenes were, and potentially even up to Cherry Hill, Cooperstown area. I think that would be great to to take people on a series of tours connected with
Yeah.
the campaign or otherwise.
August
Susan,
27th, we do a
go ahead.
rededication of Fort Greene Monument, and you're all invited.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
wonderful. August 27th?
Fort Greene Monument, August 27th at 10 a.m. sharp. And
Okay.
we do a rededication, we do a laying of the wreath, we do the ringing of the bells for the sailors and soldiers and civilians that were murdered basically by the British in the prison ships.
Yeah.
11,500 that we know of, and the estimates are more. But we rededicate that monument every single year. We've done it ever since 1888.
Wow. Well, we
Yeah.
definitely should do that.
Well,
Do you have,
this past year we did it, but the year before it was only a small contingent, only 12 people, and we stayed 12 foot apart. Social distance. Not that
well,
it
we
did
can
any
do,
good because I got the COVID. So.
oh, not there though, I hope.
I think I
I
got it
guess.
when I went to get tested at a testing facility. If you think about a testing facility, everyone that thinks they have it because they're sick, where do they go? They go get tested.
Testing. Yeah.
And then you're going to be there in line and waiting to get tested with a whole bunch of people that might or might not have the COVID.
Right.
It's a
Now, I
little weird
wanted
to
to
think.
ask Susan, if people in Cherry Valley, is this something generally that's sort of part of the culture there, that people take this history as their own, or is it not that well known? Are there annual events or things?
There was a kind of like a little ceremony this year, but it wasn't as big as we had. We used to have reenactments, but
Mm.
around our area right now, reenactors are kind of few and far between at the moment. We do have the Fort Plain Museum, which is the Fort Plain Military Museum, which is not too far from where Cherry Valley is. Um, Oriskany, I can get to pretty about 45 minutes away. We are very rural, so you have to realize that. But we have the museum is uh, does all kinds of tours, and we get buses out here. The DAR has been out here several times. So I mean, we Cherry Valley is one of those things that it played a very pivotal role, but there's so much American history that should be visited again by our school systems, and we aren't doing that. In the last 5 years, it's been very dismal with what we have
Longer than
been
that.
taught in the schools, and
Yeah.
it just doesn't even go anywhere near. My favorite saying to people is when you, and I hate to do this, but when you make history politically correct, sometimes history becomes a fairy tale. And I've been kind of parading that around a lot lately because we're making it sometimes what it isn't, and you people do such a great job in starting to bring history back to the where it is, where it was, what it is, and what it should be, and what it actually is. And I haven't seen that in the last 5 to 8 years. Really, a lot of it's left out. A lot of history is left out.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I try to
Yeah.
get people to follow me, but even my children, they're so busy with their lives,
Hmm.
uh, it's such a difficult thing for them to commit any time to it and follow even what I give them and what I ask them to read. They do from time to time. They do read some of it, but like I said, my son's an engineer. He's an audio engineer, and my daughter is in the
Mm.
Navy. She's also working for Delta Airlines. So it's for the youth of today. I have to say, I feel bad for them because
Yeah.
all the modern conveniences we have, all the technology we have, it's supposed to make our lives easier and simplified and more free time. But I mean, in the last 10 years, this stupid little thing that we carry around, this mobile communication device, is choking us. It's like we have to be hooked to that. We have to be connected to that. I drove down to my office, which is 4 miles from my home, and I left my cell phone on the charger on my desk. I had to go back and get it. I just could not say, "Oh, geez, I don't need a phone today," or someone's going to call me on my office phone, which I don't even need an office phone. I don't need a home phone.
Hmm.
It's choking us. It's really the technology is choking us, and I do like um, Musk, Elon Musk. He's
Hmm.
brilliant. I really have to say the things he's saying, are brilliant. I do have to admonish him a little bit because in a battle of wits, he's dealing with unarmed people. He's dueling with unarmed people.
Yeah.
Well, I think
So
on this, the the phone question is not merely passive, it's active because that's how they create the divisiveness that Lynn was talking about. Because they get your profile if you're on the social media, or even if you're ordering stuff online, or even if you're speaking, because they record all your words, they record everything you say. So if you say, "Oh, I have back pain," the next thing you know, you start getting ads popping up for devices to stop. I mean, it's really alarming. I was thinking, especially given that I'm running against Schumer, who's got all 17 intelligence agencies in his camp, that I'm going to
don't bet,
have to
don't bet on that. Don't bet on that.
I'm going to have to create I'm going to have to create a different profile, like pretend that I like, I don't know, smoked jellyfish or something, and create weird searches. so
Um,
so
there's a
it's
lot of people
terrible.
in the intelligence agency that do not like him, especially for what he said about the 6 ways from Sunday.
Exactly.
That was they don't like him for that. And if you follow back in his past, he's done some pretty messed up things. So
Yes.
I'm not going to talk about that in this venue here, but um, he's not a nice person, and neither is Nadler. And I do have hope for AOC when she wakes up, just like what's her name, the that Norwegian girl, the one that's so
Swedish.
uh,
You mean Greta
yeah,
Thunberg?
Greta Thunberg. Yes,
Greta-
I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
couldn't remember it, but they're young, and I do have hope that they like open their eyes and stop anesthetizing their perceptors because you see these things. How could you miss these things? And if you're missing them, either you're missing them on purpose, or you're just following along with the status quo. Correct me if I'm
Right.
wrong.
Mhm.
Well, I think we have a real job to do. I think reality
Yes.
is going to be banging down our door because we're shutting down our energy supply by shutting down nuclear power and then banning fossil fuels. So we're not going to have any energy. We're destroying our farms. Someone just sent over an article to me today, which shows that I forget what, I think in the last 10 years or something like that, the price of fertilizer, feed, everything, that the expenses, energy, all that you need for farming has exactly doubled. The farmers aren't getting paid doubled, so we're not going to have food. We see the situation with water. We were talking about that. The pipes, the sewer systems, the horrific state of repair. So the things that people take for granted, like energy, water, food, are actually in jeopardy. And our job, in a sense, my campaign, I see, is to wake people up and to say this isn't, human beings should not live this way. It's natural for human beings to have a higher standard of living from one generation to the next. The people who come after us should live longer, be healthier, be better educated, play more musicians, be composers, be Albert Einsteins. Uh, and I think the United States was really dedicated to that. When we say freedom, it doesn't mean the right to do whatever you want. It means that you have an opportunity to develop, to make a discovery, to challenge authority. Because what is a scientific discovery? Every scientific discovery has thrown on its head everything that was believed previously.
Einstein.
Yeah, and that's why it's so controversial. And interestingly, you can make scientific discoveries about history, right? If you have the openness and willingness to study, you can discover that your understanding of a particular event or a particular individual was all wrong. The other thing about this, and I think history and classical drama, in a sense, go together, because when you study history, or you're studying a play by Shakespeare or Schiller, what you discover is the complexity of human beings. That unlike the computerized world where it's this binary, it's either good or bad, it's either up or down or right or wrong, or what you discover when you look at these things is that people change, and that human beings sometimes do things that are, I mean, I'm absolutely consistent and perfect all the time, but many people, many people are not. And you do things in I once went, it was the wisest thing I ever saw in a doctor's office or somewhere. They had a little instruction that said, if you are hungry, tired, or something else, or have a bad headache, don't comment on whatever it was. I thought that was very, very good advice. So I would like to propose here in conclusion that we take up this initiative of the 250th anniversary of our republic, that we collaborate on this and think of ways to educate large numbers of people. I mean, the state of New York is so rich in this history of our nation, what happened here, and not only the revolution, but the developments, the things that came out of West Point. I mean, scientific discovery, infrastructure building, all kinds of things, that we should really work on this to create a citizenry that's qualified to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation in a way that's appropriate.
How can we do that? How can we turn
Yeah.
around and let people see that this is a asset that we have to explore, and the youth, it has to be in the schools, because while our youth and our young youth in our schools are being indoctrinated in one direction, how can we
Yeah.
move that direction to the right direction, to the righteous direction? Um, a lot of people are taking their kids in my district here. They're taking their kids out of the New York City public schools and putting them into religious schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, yeshivas. And it seems to me that those people, those children, are much more respectful, much more tolerant of each other, and they're not allowed to use their cell phones in class, and a lot of different positive uniforms. They're all wearing uniforms, and the way that years ago, I mean, if you didn't have Nike Air something on your feet or a certain kind of hat or shirt, you were ridiculed for being either poor or not meeting muster. But now, when you have to wear a uniform, and it's all the same company that makes the uniform, and those companies make pretty much a lot of money, but they're basically all local. um, it takes all that out of the education program. And
Well,
what's so wrong about having like Zavarian High School that my son went to, all boys, and then Bishop
yeah.
Connie, where my daughter went to, all girls. It takes the distraction right out of the equation, and then they learn very well. They're very smart children, very educated, very well versed.
Lynn, were
I
you
know
trying to
that
say something?
yeah, I know we're running close out of time, but one idea I have is why don't we approach some of these schools, public as well as the private schools, and around the idea of getting for the 250th anniversary, getting all of the kids to actually personify an individual involved in the American Revolution. That was one of the things that was really refreshing about this reenactment ceremony, that people didn't just represent a sort of blank, I'm a soldier in such and such a regiment, but they represented Colonel Glover. They represented um, uh, Knox. They represented many people whose names I did not know. So, for example, there was a whole group of African American reenactors that represented various people, not just in the Marblehead division, but other parts of the army, and they actually knew the history of those individuals. Uh, I think that would be something, a very exciting challenge if we set uh, the youth, if they took up the idea that they were actually going to study in depth over a period of 3 months, 6 months, a year, a particular individual. Because one of the sad things, of course, when you go even to these reenactments, and we see it in various things that are worthwhile in the society. You have 12 people there, like Mike was saying, or you have a situation in that most of the reenactors were elderly. I mean, they should actually be the people who are the age of the people who were involved in those battles, who were 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. That would make a world of difference. And I think that's one of the ways of getting it going. Uh, I recall when we were uh, when we've met a lot of musicians who've become actually classical musicians. Diane will remember that that they've always said to us, I saw Marian Anderson, or I saw Roland Hayes. I saw a classical musician, and I wanted to be like that. So if we can create the basis where young people begin to say, I want to be like that. I want to be that type of character with that kind of courage, that kind of intellect, that kind of creativity. I think this will make a world of difference. So I would recommend that we do with this project, that we approach some of these learning institutions and get them to be part of this project with their students.
Good idea. Good
Yes,
idea.
that sounds like
Next time I speak to Eric Adams, I'm gonna bring it up and I'm gonna say, listen, we're coming close to this anniversary, and we should have the schools, public schools too. We should have them do
yeah,
this.
yeah,
He's
and
a
we
member
should
of the
revive.
Society of Open, by the way.
Oh, good. We should revive Evacuation Day. I think we should really celebrate getting the British Empire out of the country.
It used to be a big celebration, but you're
Yeah,
anti-Anglo if you're bringing that up. You
I
know,
know. Well, that's part of the problem. I think it is really, we've gone way, way over, but I've so enjoyed this discussion, and I think our
me
listeners
too. I
have.
have. Thank you again for inviting me on.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, very much
Okay.
for joining us, and Lynn and
I
Mike.
didn't,
And I hope we'll be seeing a lot more of each other, because I think we have a lot of work to do.
Anytime.
this,
I'll adjust my
one,
schedule around you guys.
one last thing. Another resource: the New York State Historical Association puts out a contest every year, a writing contest for certain children in certain age groups. I think it's like fourth, fifth, sixth grades, and they do quite a nice job. They haven't had many of the the kids that they used to have. But that's another good resource. And it's a
Great.
statewide organization, and it's got a lot of chapters, and we have not only the village and the town historical association, we have we have a county historical association, and it's big. It's a pretty good, but they're really good resources. Really good resources.
Well, we should promote that. We should definitely promote that. We should promote these competitions and things and make sure that people know about it and can participate. So you're right, that's a good resource. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And to all my guests, next Friday, I can't believe it, but it's Christmas Eve. And I'm actually planning a special program which will involve musical performances. And I and many of our friends are hopefully going to have time to practice and put something together for you. So we'll see you Christmas Eve. And thanks again, and good night.